Steve Harvey was in the middle of his morning radio show when his producer handed him a letter that would change everything. What he read on air made him break down completely, and by the end of it, Steve was crying uncontrollably in front of millions of listeners. It was Thursday morning, October 5th, 2023, at 9:12 a.m. Eastern Time. Steve Harvey was hosting his nationally syndicated morning radio show, The Steve Harvey Morning Show, from his studio in Atlanta. The show was going exactly as planned. Steve was in the middle of his popular segment where he gives life advice to callers when his producer, Marcus, walked into the studio with an unusual expression on his face. Marcus held up an envelope and mouthed the words, "You need to read this now," to Steve. In 28 years of radio, Marcus had never interrupted Steve during a live segment, unless it was absolutely critical. Steve's instinct told him something was different about this moment. Steve quickly wrapped up his conversation with the current caller and addressed his audience of over 8 million listeners. "Folks, my producer just handed me something that apparently can't wait," Steve said, his voice showing curiosity. "Let me see what we got here." Steve took the envelope from Marcus, and what he read would become one of the most emotional moments ever broadcast on radio. The letter was from a woman named Emma Peterson, a high school English teacher from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Steve had never heard of Emma Peterson, but she was about to deliver news that would shake him to his core. "Dear Mr. Harvey," Steve began reading aloud, his voice steady at first. "I'm writing to tell you about my daughter Emma, who was 16 years old when she took her own life 3 weeks ago." Steve stopped reading. His hand holding the letter began to shake visibly. The studio fell completely silent. What Steve didn't know was that for the past year, Emma Peterson had been battling severe depression and anxiety. Emma's parents had been devastated watching their bright, talented daughter struggle with thoughts that terrified them. Emma had been in therapy, on medication, and her parents had done everything they could to help her. Emma's one source of comfort during her darkest days had been listening to Steve Harvey's morning radio show. Even on the mornings when she didn't want to go to school, when she felt like giving up completely, Emma insisted on listening to Steve's jokes, his advice, and his daily motivational messages. Emma's mother, Linda, had tried several times to reach out to Steve's show over the past year, sending emails about how much Steve's words meant to her daughter, but those messages had never reached Steve directly. They had been handled by his staff and filed away with thousands of other fan letters. What Emma Peterson didn't know was that Emma had been secretly writing in a journal, documenting the specific things Steve said that helped her want to keep living. It had become Emma's lifeline, this connection to a voice that made her feel less alone. Steve took a deep breath and continued reading the letter aloud, his voice already cracking with emotion. "Mr. Harvey, Emma listened to your show every single morning before school. She told me that your voice was the only thing that could make her smile on the days when everything felt too heavy to carry." Steve's eyes filled with tears, but he kept reading. "3 weeks ago, Emma lost her battle with depression. But before I tell you why I'm writing, I need you to know that you gave my daughter 365 extra days. Her therapist had said she might not make it through the winter, but every morning she'd listen to you, and somehow she'd find the strength to try one more day." Steve's voice broke completely. He couldn't continue reading. The studio was silent except for the sound of Steve's labored breathing as he tried to maintain his composure on air. Marcus, the producer, was crying too. The entire radio crew watched as Steve struggled with the magnitude of what he was reading. After nearly a minute of silence, Steve forced himself to continue. "Mr. Harvey, I'm writing because after Emma died, I found her journal. She had been writing down your quotes, your advice, your jokes, everything that helped her want to keep living. She called it her Reasons to Stay journal, and it was filled with your words." Steve put his head down on the desk, his shoulders shaking with sobs. His 8 million listeners could hear him completely breaking down. "I'm sorry," Steve whispered into the microphone. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea." Steve tried to compose himself enough to keep reading. "Mr. Harvey, Emma's last journal entry was the morning before she died. She wrote, 'Mr. Steve said today that even when we can't see the light, it's still there. I'm trying to believe that. I'm trying so hard.'" That sentence destroyed Steve completely. He began sobbing uncontrollably, unable to speak for nearly 3 minutes. The sound of a man crying over a teenager he had never met but who had been fighting to survive, partly because of his words, was one of the most powerful moments ever broadcast on radio. "I'm sorry," Steve finally managed to say through his tears. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save her. I'm sorry I never knew she needed more help." Steve took another shaky breath and finished reading the letter. "Mr. Harvey, I'm not writing to blame you or to make you sad. I'm writing because Emma wanted you to know that you mattered. In her journal, she wrote a letter she planned to send you someday when she felt better. She wrote, 'Dear Mr. Steve, you probably don't know that you're the reason I'm still here, but you are. Thank you for being my friend every morning.'" Steve was crying so hard he could barely breathe, let alone speak. Linda's letter continued, "Mr. Harvey, Emma wanted to use the money she'd saved from her part-time job to come see your show live someday. She had $412 in an envelope labeled Dream Fund. I just found a note with the money that said, 'If something happens to me, please use this to help other kids who feel like I do. Maybe Mr. Steve can help them the way he helped me.'" Steve Harvey, one of the most composed entertainers in the business, couldn't continue the show. For the first time in his career, he had to take an unscheduled break during a live broadcast. I need a minute," Steve managed to say. "Please, just give me a minute." The show went to an emergency commercial break. For 20 minutes, Steve sat in the studio, crying and trying to process what he had just read. When Steve returned to the air, his voice was still thick with emotion, but he had made a decision that would change his show forever. "Ladies and gentlemen, I just read a letter from Linda Peterson about her daughter Emma, who lost her battle with depression 3 weeks ago. For over a year, Emma listened to this show every morning, and somehow, without me ever knowing it, our show became part of her fight to stay alive." Steve paused to collect himself. "Emma saved $412 from her part-time job because she wanted to see this show live someday. Instead, her dying wish was to use that money to help other teenagers who are struggling with depression and thoughts of suicide." Steve's voice broke again. "So, starting today, we're launching the Emma Peterson Hope Foundation. We're going to make sure that every teenager in America knows that there's help, that there's hope, and that their life matters more than they can possibly imagine." The response to Steve's emotional breakdown and Emma's story was immediate and unprecedented. Within hours, the show's website crashed from the volume of people trying to learn more about Emma Peterson and how they could help. But more than donations, something else happened. Thousands of teenagers and young adults reached out to share their own struggles with depression and suicidal thoughts. Many said that hearing Steve cry over Emma's story made them realize that people would care if they were gone, that their life mattered to others in ways they couldn't see. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline reported a 4% increase in calls from teenagers the day Emma's story aired. 3 weeks later, Linda Peterson appeared as a guest on Steve's television show. When Steve saw her walk onto the stage, he immediately stood up and hugged her, both of them crying again. "Mrs. Peterson, your daughter changed my life," Steve said. "She reminded me why I really do this work. Every word matters. Every morning matters." Linda had brought something with her that she wanted to share with Steve and the audience, Emma's Reasons to Stay journal, where she had written down quotes from Steve's show that helped her. March 12th, Linda read from Emma's journal. "Mr. Steve said today, 'Your current situation is not your final destination.' I needed to hear that. Maybe tomorrow will be better." May 8th, Mr. Steve talked about how everybody has a purpose even when we can't see it yet. Maybe my purpose is still coming. I should stick around to find out. September 30th, Mr. Steve made me laugh today. Even though I felt terrible, he said something about his wife that made me laugh out loud. It was the first time I laughed in weeks. Thank you, Mr. Steve." Steve was crying again, and so was everyone in the studio audience. October 3rd, 2 days before she died. Linda's voice cracked as she read the final entry. "Mr. Steve said that even when we can't see the light, it's still there. I'm trying to believe that. I'm trying so hard. If I can just make it through today, maybe tomorrow will be the day I finally feel okay again." The studio was completely silent except for the sound of people crying. The Emma Peterson Hope Foundation became one of the most impactful charitable organizations ever launched by an entertainer. Within its first year, the foundation had created mental health support programs in over 300 high schools across the country. But the foundation did more than just provide resources. It created peer support networks, funded therapy for teenagers who couldn't afford it, trained teachers and parents to recognize warning signs of depression, and most importantly, created a 24/7 text line specifically for teenagers who needed someone to talk to. Steve Harvey's emotional breakdown on live radio changed how he approached his show forever. He began including more direct messages about mental health, suicide prevention, and the importance of reaching out for help. He also started a daily segment called Emma's Minute, where he would share an uplifting message specifically for young people who were struggling, always ending with, "Your life matters. You matter. Please stay." Emma taught me that we never know who's listening and what they're going through, Steve said during a later interview. Every word we say might be exactly what someone needs to hear to make it through one more day. Steve began making unannounced visits to high schools around the country, talking openly with students about mental health, depression, and suicide prevention. He would often stay for hours talking with teenagers who were struggling and connecting them with the resources. "I do this for Emma," Steve would tell the students he visited. "She showed me that sometimes just showing up, just being present, just saying the right thing at the right time can be the difference between someone giving up and someone holding on." Emma's journal, with Linda's permission, was eventually published as a book called Reasons to Stay, Emma's Story. All proceeds went to the Emma Peterson Hope Foundation. The book became required reading in many high schools and has been translated into 18 languages. Parents and teenagers around the world use Emma's words to start conversations about depression, hope, and the importance of staying alive even when life feels impossible. Every year, on October 5th, the anniversary of the letter that changed everything, Steve Harvey dedicates his entire radio show to Emma Peterson's memory. He reads from her journal, shares updates on the foundation's work, and most importantly, speaks directly to teenagers who might be struggling. "Emma never got to see this show live," Steve says during each anniversary show, "but she taught me more about the responsibility I have as someone with a microphone than anyone else ever has. Every morning, I'm talking to Emma and to all the Emmas out there who need to hear that life is worth living." Linda Peterson became a full-time advocate for teenage mental health and suicide prevention. She speaks at schools and conferences around the world, sharing Emma's story and fighting for better mental health resources for young people. "Losing Emma was devastating," Linda says, "but knowing that her story has helped thousands of other teenagers choose to stay alive makes me feel like her life had meaning beyond what any of us could have imagined." Today, the Emma Peterson Hope Foundation has raised over $60 million for teenage mental health initiatives. It has helped over 25,000 teenagers access mental health care they couldn't afford, and the foundation's crisis text line has responded to over 2 million messages from teenagers in crisis. The foundation's headquarters features a recording studio where teenagers can record messages of hope that are played on radio stations around the world, continuing Emma's legacy of using words to help others want to keep living. The letter that made Steve Harvey cry on live radio proved that sometimes the people we impact most are the ones we never meet. Emma Peterson listened to Steve's show every morning for over a year, drawing strength and hope from a voice she heard through the radio. Steve never knew Emma existed until after she was gone. But Emma's courage in fighting her depression for as long as she did, and Linda's courage in sharing her daughter's story, transformed Steve's understanding of his responsibility as an entertainer and public figure. Today, teenagers across America listen to the Steve Harvey Morning Show, and many of them reach out to share their struggles. Some write letters, just as Linda had done, creating new connections between a radio host and young people fighting to stay alive. "Emma started a conversation between me and teenagers I'll never meet," Steve says. "Every morning when I speak into this microphone, I'm talking to Emma and to everyone out there who's struggling. I'm telling them, please stay. Your life matters more than you know." The letter that interrupted Steve Harvey's radio show was only 3 pages long, but it created a legacy that will last forever. Emma Peterson's battle with depression inspired a foundation that has saved thousands of lives and created resources that may prevent other families from experiencing the same devastating loss. Steve Harvey's emotional response showed millions of listeners that successful people aren't immune to heartbreak, and that sometimes the most important thing a person with a platform can do is cry openly about tragedy and use their voice to create change. The conversation between a radio host and A grieving mother proved that words have power, that impact transcends physical presence, and that sometimes the most important connections happen between people who never meet face to face, but touch each other's lives in ways that change everything. Emma Peterson never got to see Steve Harvey's show live, but through her story, she taught millions of people that life is worth fighting for, that reaching out for help is brave, and that we never know whose life we might be saving just by showing up and being authentically ourselves every single day. If this incredible story of unexpected impact and lasting legacy moved your heart, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who might be struggling and needs to know that their life matters. Have you ever been helped by someone who didn't know they were helping you? Let us know in the comments. And please, if you're struggling, reach out for help. Your life matters more than you can possibly imagine.